Madeline Harris exhaled as she slid into her window seat in row 14 of the crowded Airbus A320. She'd chosen it deliberately, paying extra for the view and the peace it offered. The window was her sanctuary, a small escape in the chaos of air travel. With a long flight ahead, she was ready, her book, noise-canceling headphones, and the simple expectation of being left alone. The cabin buzzed with boarding passengers, overhead compartments slammed shut, and flight attendants moved swiftly through the aisles. Madeline adjusted her seatbelt and began reading, trying to tune out the noise. She didn't notice the father and daughter until they stopped beside her. A firm voice broke her concentration. "Excuse me, I need you to move." Madeline blinked up at the man towering over her. He was in his late 40s, well-dressed, with salt and pepper hair neatly combed. His expensive watch gleamed under the lights and his posture radiated entitlement. Beside him, a small girl clutched a stuffed rabbit against her chest. She had wide, nervous eyes avoiding Madeline's gaze. Madeline hesitated. "I'm sorry." The man sighed dramatically. "My daughter needs the window seat. She gets anxious during flights." He gestured toward the empty aisle seat next to her. "I asked you to switch." Madeline's brows furrowed. "I paid for this seat," she said, her tone steady. The man, Gregory Turner, looked surprised, as if the concept of being told no was foreign to him. His expression hardened. "She's a child," he repeated, speaking slowly, as if Madeline hadn't understood. "You get that, right?" Madeline's pulse quickened. She understood perfectly. A grown man, with a Rolex and a leather briefcase, had failed to plan for his daughter's needs. He assumed she would accommodate him without question. But she wasn't going to. She had paid for this seat, and she wasn't giving it up. "I do understand," she said calmly, "but I paid for this seat, and I'm not moving." Gregory's lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. Then louder, he added, "This is what's wrong with people today. No decency." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Madeline could feel the eyes of nearby passengers on her, some curious, some awkward. She knew what he was trying to do, make her the villain. It made her stomach tighten. Before she could respond, a flight attendant appeared in the aisle. A woman in her late 40s, sharp-eyed and poised, stopped beside them. Her name tag read Sandra Brooks. "Is there a problem here?" Sandra asked, her voice calm but firm. Gregory immediately spoke up. "Yes, this woman refuses to give up her seat for my daughter. She's being unreasonable." Sandra glanced at Madeline. "You booked this seat?" she asked. Madeline nodded. "Yes." Turning back to Gregory, Sandra replied, "Sir, she has the seat assigned to her." Gregory scoffed. "I'm aware of that, but I'm asking you to do the right thing. Help us resolve this." Sandra remained calm. "Customer service doesn't mean forcing another passenger to move from their seat. If you need a window seat for your daughter, I'll check for other available ones, but I won't ask her to move." Gregory's face reddened, but he wasn't backing down. "This isn't about rules," he said, his voice rising just enough to draw attention. "This is about decency, kindness, a grown woman refusing to accommodate a child." Madeline felt a surge of frustration. It was always the same, this pressure to give in, but she wasn't about to let him win. Sandra moved slightly closer to Madeline, her voice low but steady. "I understand your concern, sir, but if you don't take your assigned seat, I'll have to take further action." Gregory glared at Madeline, his frustration boiling over, but Sandra's words held firm. The tension in the aisle grew thicker. Gregory's face flushed with frustration, but he wasn't ready to give up. He turned back to Madeline, glaring at her as though she were the source of all his problems. His voice dropped to a mocking tone. "You really won't move for a child?" he asked, as if it were incomprehensible that anyone would refuse to accommodate a young girl. Madeline's hands tightened around her book, but her voice remained calm, unwavering. "I paid for this seat. I'm not moving." Gregory's jaw tightened and he shifted his stance, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "This is exactly what's wrong with society today," he spat, louder now so that the entire cabin could hear him. "People are so selfish, unwilling to help others, even when it's something small." Madeline's stomach churned, her face flushing with embarrassment as the surrounding passengers turned to listen. She could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others unsure of what was happening. Gregory's words hung in the air like a challenge, an unspoken accusation that she was the one being unreasonable. "Why are you making this such a big deal?" Gregory continued, his voice rising. "Just switch seats with my daughter. It's not that hard." Madeline refused to let him manipulate her into backing down. Her gaze never wavered. "I'm not making a big deal. You're the one causing a scene." She glanced around, noticing the increasing discomfort in the faces of nearby passengers. "And it's not just about the seat. You think you can just tell people what to do because you're uncomfortable? Well, I'm not going to let you push me around." Gregory's face darkened, his frustration bubbling over. He crossed his arms, glaring at her. "You're unbelievable. You know this is exactly why people don't like people like you," he sneered, trying to create a divide between them. "You don't have any respect." Madeline's pulse quickened, but she held firm, refusing to flinch. She had heard that kind of talk before, the insidious attempt to turn the tables, to make the person who stands their ground feel like the villain. It wasn't going to work this time. Before Gregory could escalate things further, Sandra stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "Sir," she said firmly, her tone final, "I've already told you, this seat is assigned to her. You need to take your seat, or I will have to take further action." Gregory blinked, taken aback for a moment. He had clearly expected Sandra to bend to his demands, but she wasn't giving an inch. Madeline could see the shift in his expression, the way the anger shifted to confusion, followed by a growing sense of panic. He quickly tried to regain control, his voice sharp. "You know, I've had enough of this. I'm not going to let some random stranger ruin my daughter's flight experience," he growled, raising his voice once more. "This is about decency, about treating others with respect." Sandra didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge his tantrum. "I've asked you to take your seat, sir," she said, her words cutting through his tirade. "If you continue to escalate this situation, I'll have no choice but to involve security." The air in the cabin felt thick with tension. Madeline could feel the weight of every set of eyes on her now. The pressure to give in was almost unbearable. She had half expected the flight attendant to back down, to give him a little leeway. But Sandra's stance only grew stronger. Gregory looked around, realizing that the atmosphere in the cabin was shifting. Some passengers were starting to openly shake their heads, glancing at him with expressions of disapproval. Others had a look of quiet sympathy toward Madeline. The reality of the situation was settling in. He was losing. "Fine," Gregory said finally, his voice seething with barely contained rage. "But you haven't heard the last of this." He turned on his heel, the words hanging in the air like a threat. As Gregory stalked off toward his seat, Sandra exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing. Madeline looked up at her, a quiet sense of relief washing over her. The tension had finally broken, but only for a moment. The entire cabin seemed to release a collective breath as the confrontation dissipated. Madeline didn't let herself relax entirely. She knew this wasn't over. She could feel Gregory's eyes on her as he returned to his seat. His glare was cold, full of resentment. The momentary victory didn't feel as sweet as it should have. Sandra caught Madeline's gaze and gave her a small nod, a wordless acknowledgement of the tension that had just unfolded. But before she could speak again, Gregory, still seething, muttered something under his breath. Madeline couldn't hear it, but she could see the hateful sneer on his face as he glanced back at her. Her stomach twisted, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a response. This wasn't her fight. This was about standing her ground, and she had done just that. But Gregory wasn't done yet, and she knew it. Gregory returned to his seat, his posture stiff and rigid. Madeline could feel the heat of his glare, even from several rows away. The cabin had settled, but the uneasy feeling lingered in the air. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop. She could hear murmurs around her, quiet whispers, but nobody dared to speak too loudly. The tension was palpable, thickening with every passing second. Madeline tried to refocus on her book, but her thoughts kept drifting. She had held her ground. There was a strange sense of pride in that, but she could still feel the burn of Gregory's glare from behind her. It was as if he were trying to force her to break, to flinch, to show any sign of weakness, but she wouldn't. She couldn't. A few moments passed. The plane began its taxi toward the runway, and the usual pre-flight announcements played over the intercom. But the noise felt distant, as if the world outside the plane had faded away. All she could focus on was the simmering tension that had yet to fully dissipate. She knew Gregory wasn't the type of person to just let things go. As the plane taxied down the runway and the engines roared to life, Madeline tried to close her eyes, but she could still feel his presence, his hostility lingering in the air around her. She gripped her book tighter, trying to ignore the unease that had settled in her chest. Then, just as the plane lifted off and the cabin noise grew louder, a voice broke through the hum of conversation. "Excuse me," came a voice from behind her, soft but insistent. Madeline turned slightly in her seat, and her gaze met that of the man sitting behind her. He looked to be in his mid-40s, wearing a dark green hoodie and wire-rimmed glasses. His expression was calm, but there was an underlying intensity in his eyes. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at Sandra, who was still in the aisle nearby, assisting other passengers. Sandra turned, her face neutral as she noticed the man. "I just wanted to say," the man continued, his voice steady but firm, "you're doing the right thing. That guy was out of line." Madeline blinked, surprised by the man's words. She hadn't expected anyone to speak up. Most passengers had remained silent, either out of discomfort or reluctance to get involved. But here was someone who wasn't afraid to show support. Sandra nodded slightly in acknowledgement, but kept her focus on the situation unfolding. "Thank you," she said simply, but her eyes remained on Gregory, who was now shifting in his seat, looking more and more agitated as the flight progressed. Madeline felt a strange sense of solidarity, but the unease in her stomach remained. She had stood her ground, yes, but she knew Gregory wouldn't let this go so easily. She could feel the simmering anger inside him, and she wasn't sure how long it would take for him to snap again. Sure enough, within minutes, Gregory stood up abruptly, his movements sharp and jerky. His face was twisted in anger, and Madeline's heart skipped a beat as she saw him walking toward her. The man in the green hoodie glanced at her, but he didn't say anything. Madeline held her breath, bracing herself. Gregory walked down the aisle with purpose, his eyes locked on her. He didn't stop when he reached her row, and Madeline could feel the tension surge once again. He was coming for her, coming to finish what he had started. Sandra, who had been moving down the aisle, noticed Gregory's approach. Her eyes narrowed, and she moved to intercept him. "Sir, please return to your seat," Sandra said calmly, but there was an unmistakable authority in her voice. "You're disrupting other passengers." Gregory stopped, but only for a moment. "I'm not sitting next to someone like her," he sneered, glaring at Madeline. Madeline's heart raced as the words hung in the air, the sheer audacity of his actions. He was still trying to manipulate the situation, trying to force her to back down. His behavior was beyond unreasonable now. It was threatening. "I'm asking you again, sir," Sandra said, her voice firm, "to return to your seat, or I will have to ask you to leave the plane." The air in the cabin seemed to freeze. The murmurs that had been present earlier died down, replaced by tense silence. Passengers had started to notice what was happening, and Madeline could feel their eyes shifting between her, Gregory, and Sandra. There was no mistaking what was at stake now. Gregory was pushing too far. Madeline clenched her fists, the fight-or-flight instinct kicking in. She could see the decision playing out on Gregory's face. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darted around the cabin as if searching for support. But there was none. The passengers were watching, and the flight crew wasn't backing down. Gregory finally sneered, "You know what? Fine." His voice was low, seething with barely contained rage. "I'll stay in my seat, but you're going to regret this." Without waiting for a response, he turned and stomped back toward his seat. The cabin remained tense, but the worst seemed to be over, for now. Madeline let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Sandra exhaled slowly, looking at Madeline briefly before returning to her duties. The passengers, now much more relaxed, resumed their conversations, though the whispers were louder now. Some had clearly seen the struggle, and there was a noticeable shift in the air. Gregory's outburst had done more than just disrupt the flight. It had revealed a side of entitlement that most people were uncomfortable with. Madeline leaned back in her seat, her body still tense, but relieved that the immediate confrontation had passed. The flight continued, but the storm was far from over. She knew that as long as Gregory was on this plane, there would be a simmering threat just beneath the surface. And this time, it wasn't just about the seat, it was about power. Madeline tried to shake off the uncomfortable tension that still clung to her as the flight continued. The engines hummed steadily, and passengers resumed their routines. Though the atmosphere was far from normal, her stomach was tight, and her hands were still gripping her book as though it might anchor her to reality. But it wasn't over. She knew it wasn't over. Gregory had returned to his seat, but Madeline could feel his eyes burning into the back of her head. The plane had leveled out, and the seatbelt sign was off, but it felt like there was a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Then suddenly, Gregory stood up again. This time, he didn't even bother to make it look casual. His movements were quick and sharp as he made his way down the aisle. Madeline's heart skipped a beat. She could already hear his voice in her head, the same sarcastic tone he had used earlier, accusing her of being selfish, of not caring about his daughter. Sandra was nearby, helping an elderly couple with their luggage. She was quick to spot him, her eyes narrowing as she moved to intercept him again. Gregory didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care. "You must be really proud of yourself, huh?" Gregory's voice cut through the aisle, and Madeline's chest tightened at the words. He was standing just behind her, his voice low but carrying. She didn't flinch, though every part of her wanted to snap back at him, to let him know just how utterly wrong he was. But she didn't. She held her breath, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this would be the last time he tried to push her. "You must think you're better than everyone else," Gregory continued, his voice gaining volume now. "A grown woman refusing to give up her seat for a child. I guess that's what we've become, huh? Selfish. You people don't even care. Just sitting there in your little bubble while others suffer." Madeline could feel the heat rising in her face, but she held her ground. He was trying to provoke her, make her feel guilty, maybe even force her to apologize. But she wasn't going to let him. Sandra was there, though, stepping between them. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You are disturbing the other passengers." Gregory scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Disturbing? You mean she's disturbing because she won't move for a child? You're letting her get away with this?" Madeline could feel the heat of his words, the public shaming he was trying to create. He wasn't just targeting her anymore. He was trying to manipulate the entire cabin, trying to turn them all against her. But then, a voice from across the aisle interrupted him. "She paid for the seat," came a calm voice, the words cutting through the tension. Madeline turned slightly, seeing a man in his late 30s, wearing a dark green hoodie and glasses. He was seated a few rows ahead of her, but his voice carried. "She has every right to stay in that seat." Gregory whipped his head around, clearly surprised that someone was challenging him. "What's it to you?" he shot back, his face reddening. "I'm just trying to make sure my daughter is comfortable." The man in the hoodie didn't back down. "I get that, but you're going about it all wrong. If you want her to have a window seat, maybe you should have planned better. Don't try to guilt someone else into giving up their space because you didn't." Gregory's face twisted in anger. He was losing control, and it was clear he didn't like it. His fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't dare make another move. The cabin had gone silent, and more eyes were on him now than ever before. Madeline could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The passengers were no longer quietly watching. They were beginning to react, whispering among themselves, shaking their heads. Some even exchanged glances with her, their expressions sympathetic. Gregory was losing ground. The public support he had hoped to gather was slipping away. For a brief moment, Madeline saw the panic flash in his eyes. He was trying to hold on to his dignity, but the more he spoke, the less power he had. Sandra stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to sit down," she said, her eyes meeting his with quiet authority. "If you don't return to your seat immediately, we will have to escalate this." Gregory's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths as the reality of the situation hit him. He was outnumbered. The flight crew wasn't backing down, and now passengers were watching. He was no longer the person in control. His attempt to intimidate had backfired, and all he had succeeded in doing was making himself look like the aggressor. Fine, Gregory muttered, his voice thick with venom. I'll stay in my seat, but don't think this is over. Madeline felt a wave of relief, but it didn't last long. Gregory may have backed down for now, but she knew this wasn't the end. She had been targeted, and she could still feel the pressure mounting. But for now, she had won. The cabin fell into an uneasy silence after Gregory had returned to his seat, his expression twisted in frustration. Madeline tried to steady her breath, but the tension that had built up inside her body didn't immediately fade. Every muscle was still tense, every nerve still on edge. She wanted to believe it was over, but she knew better than to relax too soon. Gregory was seething, and there was no telling what he would do next. She gripped her book tighter, trying to focus on the pages in front of her. The words were blurred as the hum of the plane seemed to echo in her head. The noise of the flight faded into the background as her mind replayed everything. Gregory's accusations, his attempts to manipulate the situation, and the sense of victory she had felt when Sandra stepped in to defend her. But that sense of victory was quickly overshadowed by the lingering unease. It wasn't long before Gregory's simmering anger boiled over once more. He stood up again, this time moving more slowly, as though carefully considering his next move. Madeline's heart skipped a beat. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't done. He was planning his next strike, and this time, it seemed like he was prepared to go all in. Before anyone could react, Gregory moved down the aisle toward her, his steps deliberate. Madeline felt the familiar rush of panic rising, but she pushed it down, refusing to let him intimidate her again. "Really?" he sneered, his voice low but filled with venom. "You're still sitting there, acting like nothing happened. You're a real piece of work, you know that?" Sandra had noticed him rising and was already making her way down the aisle, her expression colder now. She didn't hesitate this time. "Sir, please return to your seat immediately," she said, her voice sharp, the tone unmistakable. Gregory stopped, standing in front of Madeline, but not quite leaning in. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, still trying to control the situation, trying to provoke her. But Madeline was done. She was tired of the manipulation, the intimidation, and the public shaming. She met his gaze head-on, her voice steady and unwavering. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," she said, her words sharp, cutting through the tension in the cabin. "You're a man who thinks he's entitled to whatever he wants, no matter who it hurts. But you're wrong. I paid for this seat. I'm not moving for you or anyone else." Gregory's eyes widened for a split second, clearly surprised by her response. He hadn't expected her to stand her ground like this. He opened his mouth to say something, but Madeline didn't let him speak. "If you want a window seat for your daughter, maybe you should have planned better," she continued, her voice loud enough for those around them to hear. "This isn't about kindness, it's about entitlement. You don't get to make demands because you think you're above everyone else." A tense silence followed. Gregory opened his mouth again, but this time no words came out. He was caught off guard, his confidence crumbling. The tension in the cabin shifted, and passengers who had been quietly watching the scene now exchanged looks, some nodding in quiet approval of Madeline's words. Sandra stepped in again, her voice crisp and firm. "I'm asking you one last time to sit down, sir," she said. "If you do not comply, we will have no choice but to remove you from this flight." Gregory's face flushed with humiliation, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. He looked around the cabin, clearly searching for any ally, but no one spoke up. He realized then that he had no support left. His outbursts, his manipulation, his attempts at guilt, none of it had worked. "I'm not going to let you get away with this," he muttered, but the words lacked their previous bite. Sandra was unmoved. "You can either return to your seat now, or we'll have to take further action. Your choice." For the first time, Gregory hesitated. The anger that had driven him to this point faltered, replaced by something Madeline couldn't quite place. Was it fear, or just the reality of being caught in a situation he couldn't control? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Gregory let out a sharp breath and turned, stomping back to his seat. The cabin remained tense, but the worst of it had passed. Madeline's shoulders relaxed, her hands unclenching from the book she'd been holding. Gregory sat down, but the glare he shot her way was still full of fury. Madeline didn't look back. She wasn't going to let him win. The plane continued its journey, and slowly the tension in the cabin started to ease. The rest of the flight was uneventful. As the plane began its descent, Madeline reflected on what had happened. She wasn't proud of the confrontation, but she wasn't ashamed either. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had fought back against the entitlement and manipulation that so often went unchecked. As the plane touched down, the tension finally lifted, and passengers began to stand up, ready to disembark. Madeline felt a small sense of victory, not because she had won, but because she hadn't given in. She hadn't been bullied, and in the end, that was enough.